Hey guys, Igor here. In today's video, we're going to be drawing tanks, and I'm going to go through the process of how I go about doing that. So let's go ahead and get right into it. We'll begin the tank drawing process by starting with the hull, or the main body of the tank itself. This can vary in size, height, width, and this is what houses most of the other components for the tank. And speaking of components, here we have the four categories that most tanks will have. They will have a driver's position, a drivetrain of some sort, that's the transmission. Then you have the engine bay, or the power plant for the tank, and a turret basket. The turret basket might not be in the tank if it's a turretless design. The next two external components that should be visible from most sides are the turret ring and the driver's hatch. The driver's hatch being located right above the driver's position, and the turret ring being located right above the turret basket. Which moves us to the turret itself. The turret also has a commander's hatch on top for the commander to be able to view out of and also climb in and out of the tank. The turret design varies in shape and size greatly across tanks. Now we'll move on and include a drive sprocket and track idler. So these two wheels, as you can see here, are responsible for making the tank move. They don't actually touch the ground. The engine turns them, and in turn they turn the tracks. Next, we're going to want to add some suspension and road wheels. The road wheels are what actually drive over the bumpy terrain, so they're going to need that suspension to absorb some of those bumps and to be able to bend and move to get over things like trenches or rocks. Now we're ready to add the tracks and support wheels. So tracks themselves can have pretty complicated designs, but they're basically small pieces of metal with hinged ends so that they can bend, and the support wheels, as you can see here located up top, just prevent the track from sagging too much. Not all tank designs have these, but I definitely have seen some older designs with them, so I've included them here. Now we get to quite arguably the most important part of the tank, and that's the gun and the gun mantlet. So for this tank, I went with a short, larger caliber sized gun that would indicate that it shoots a slower firing, more explosive round, as opposed to a really long, thin barrel, which would fire a much faster moving round, good for destroying other tanks. I also decided to include some side skirts and mud guards on the tank itself, and these tend to go down a little bit and cover some of the tracks, so they can be used as another layer of protection, as well as prevent the mud from flying up and covering the tank entirely. And would you look at that? We have our line art for the tank complete, which can only mean one thing. We are ready to fill everything in with color. As you can see, I just went with a flat gray, and then the tracks I made a slightly different color. For the next step, we'll be adding some simple shadows. For this step, all I did was I took whatever base color that I had, I darkened it a little bit, made it a little bit more saturated, and went in and applied it to all of the crevices or all of the undersides of these parts that would not be exposed to as much light as the rest of the tank. And finally, we have the highlights, which is almost the opposite of the shadow layer. We grab a lighter color with less saturation and apply that to the top side, or the lit side of the tank. For things like the mud flaps, where you might have some bent metal pieces, I went ahead and sprinkled some of those highlights, some of that lighter color in there to really help give the illusion of bent metal. So here we are. We have our completed tank. Let's take a look at a few other designs I came up with, just to show you the variety of what is possible when drawing these things. So as you can see, these are kind of simplified models with not too much detail. Let's take a look at some more detailed paintings. Here is an example of a tank that I spent a little bit more time on, and I tried to make it more interesting by turning the tank a little. As you can see, all of the components that I have mentioned are present on this tank. For the next piece, I decided to change the angle completely, and here we have a snowy setting. Again, you can see the tank, no mud flaps or mud guards on this design, and kind of a simplistic top of the engine bay, but again, you get the idea of all of the components that are there. For this next piece, I once again changed the viewing angle to be a top-down view. One of the main standouts from this tank as opposed to the others is now we both see the driver's hatch as well as a gunner's hatch next to it on the hull. We also have a external muffler system with an exhaust, and we have some vents that we can see on top of the engine bay. And for this next piece, I did a tractor that's been modified to be a little bit more combat ready. So we've got some metal plating attached all over the place. The cockpit has a viewing port and a little machine gun sticking out of it, so it's got some offensive capability. Which brings me to the next talking point, and that is references. So I'm going to be using two really popular free-to-play games for references, and that is War Thunder and World of Tanks. So you can download both clients, go into them, and use their tanks as references by moving your camera around, taking a screenshot, and using that as a starting point to draw something. As you can see here, War Thunder has a really cool feature where you can actually see all of the internal components of the tank and how the crew are situated inside of it. And scrolling over these different components, it tells you what they are. So you can tell where the fuel tanks sit, where the ammo storage is, the engine itself, how big it is, the drivetrain, how much crew members are in it. It's really, really cool. So I highly, highly recommend if you're going to download either of the games because their file sizes aren't that small, I would probably say War Thunder has a more detailed modeling system, and you can test drive the tank and get all the different angles that you might want to then use as reference. And speaking of which, I did exactly that. I took a screenshot within the War Thunder client, and I am now going to use that T-34 reference. I have it on my other screen, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw what I see. So drawing from reference, guys, I cannot stress this enough. This is super important to do. Just like literally anything you want to learn how to draw, you want to get good at art, you have to build up a visual library. So if you start drawing tanks from imagination and you'll draw 300 tanks, you might get a little bit better. You might see some improvements, but you might be making critical errors in how tanks are actually represented in the real world. So I highly, highly recommend to study the subject, whether that's drawing from reference or looking at models, thinking about what components need to be included, because I guarantee you if you draw 100 tanks from reference in different angles, maybe even the same tank, and then somebody says, hey, draw me this tank from this perspective, like it driving away, you will end up including the right engine, position or kind of shape. The tracks will look good because these components. You've done this so many times. So to talk about the drawing real quick, I'm going in with a really rough red line drawing, and this is all done in Animate. I will show examples of some Photoshop drawings, but what I like about Animate is because it's a little bit more vector-based art, the simplicity of cutting the lines that you don't want and filling colors, everything is just really quick. It has a more cartoony vibe, but honestly, I don't mind that. It translates really well to show examples of the drawings that I'm doing. So this is sped up. I did this tank drawing in one sitting and it took about 30 minutes. Some of the other drawings that I've already covered today, the more detailed ones that I did, probably took upwards to an hour, maybe an hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours, because all of those were drawn from imagination, and that's why they don't look as accurate as this one will end up looking once I'm done. So again, I'm looking at all the different components and I'm seeing, oh, okay, this thing's got, the road wheels, the suspension is almost non-visible. On some other tank designs, the suspension is very prominent. Here we have the commander's hatch or the cupola. We have the gun mantlet. It's a pretty beefy one. And I take a look and I see, okay, the gun mantlet is divided into the outer sections, and then you have the middle moving section, so the gun can elevate up and down. Here we have the road wheels, and they have this kind of lip on the outside. There is this toolbox, I'm assuming it's a toolbox, that's attached to the top of the mud flaps. The reference also had these heavy cables that attached to these hooks in the front. I didn't include the cables, I didn't care for them, but I kept the hooks. So here you see me adding the machine gun port, I guess it would be called, and that kind of extends beyond the sloped armor. So sloped armor is another thing to consider if you're drawing a tank from imagination, because sloped armor is a very effective way to increase protection on your vehicle without increasing the weight, because you're not actually using more material, you're angling it in a way that it becomes effectively more material. So one of the cool things that I like thinking about when designing a tank from my imagination is, you know, what sort of manufacturing process would this thing have went through, and you know, where does the sloped armor fit in terms of like their budget or their technology advancement and all that. So here you see me just circling or highlighting all of the line art and changing it to a black color. I'm gonna keep the line art for the final, like until the final piece, where normally if I'm working in Photoshop or something, I typically get rid of line art and replace it with, you know, actual edges and all that. So I went with some sort of green color. I'm kind of looking at the reference, but I'm not going to match it exactly. The reference is very yellowy. I think it's more of like a sunset lighting situation. So this isn't that. You see me adding the little teeth on the tracks that go between the road wheels that will hook into the road wheels to kind of make sure that the tracks keep moving. And I'm going through and cleaning up some of the strokes that, you know, aren't supposed to be there, kind of trying to make the whole thing look a little bit nicer. Now you see me grabbing a highlight color, and with this highlight color I'm going to apply it to all of the panels, just like on the reference photos, that are being lit by, you know, the sunset. So here you see me changing to paint fill, which means I can select a specific object and paint within it without worrying about all of the other surrounding colors or strokes getting affected by it. And it's nice to use when, you know, you want to drop a detailed line without actually having to be too careful. So here you see me trying to like reposition my screen, zoom in a little and all that. So yeah, I'm going through, I'm cleaning up some of the grills on the engine. I didn't really care for how they looked. And I'm basically finishing up this drawing, putting in all the final touches for the highlights, making sure that they're in somewhat the correct place. That right there, that was the driver's lamp. I went ahead and included a little Soviet star. And then for the outer stroke, again, I did the color fill with a lighter color. Not really worrying about too much, you know, whether it looks exactly as is. This is more just an example for you guys. But even looking at the tank now with this zoomed out view, I can tell that's a T-34, you know, that's a pretty accurate representation of, you know, the tank itself. And I don't sit and draw tanks every day. This is just me sitting down, hey, I'm going to do a little reference recording for you guys so that I can show you if I was to do that, that's how I would tackle it. So I highly recommend this process for literally any subject that you're trying to learn. Here is the reference photo and the final product. The tank itself, I think, turned out all right. I could have spent a little bit more time on it, made sure the angles and all that were correct, but overall I'm pretty happy with it. Here is a SketchUp of some of those Photoshop tanks that I've been telling you guys about. And with that said, I hope you learned something. Hopefully you got something from this video. Stay tuned for the next tutorial. I think I'm going to be covering planes. That was requested by a couple of you guys. That should be fun. Anyways, thanks for watching. Thanks for liking and subscribing. I will see you guys in the next one.